Hey y'all, it's Kate from the Apothecary and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm back for episode 6 of my top favorite 100 books I've read on Goodreads. Today is a little bit of a lot of different things. We've got some classics, we've got some contemporary, we've got self-pub, we got a lot of different things, so I'm just gonna jump right into it. Our first book up on this set is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is a classic. This is American lit. For me, John Steinbeck is one of the most underappreciated classic writers that there is. A lot of people don't read him or recognize him, but his writing is just so good. And I'll talk about why in just a minute. First, let's get to our spoiler-free summary. This was first released in 1937. We have George, who is small, quick, and, quote, dark of face, and Lenny, who is large in size, but, quote, the mind of a young child. They have formed a family and share a dream to own an acre of land and their own shack. Lenny and George face the world of California during the Great Depression. And the Great Depression is a setting in many of John Steinbeck's books. He is really good at capturing that feel of the Great Depression. In George and Lenny's setting is marked by petty tyranny, misunderstanding, jealousy, and callousness. Now, why is this one on my list besides being one of the greatest classics ever, in my opinion? Like I said, John Steinbeck is very unappreciated author, but I feel like his prose is so accessible to just the everyday person. You don't have to have any certain degrees to understand it, any kind of reading under your belt. I feel like anyone coming off the street, proverbially, can pick up a John Steinbeck book and understand it at the most rudimentary level. He provides a masterclass on setting, especially in this book taking place in California during the Great Depression. It is dusty, it is dirty, it is down to the bare bones, and you feel that while you're reading Of Mice and Men. And you get the same thing during The Grapes of Wrath and The Dust Bowl. It just is a masterclass in how to write setting. There is extremely deep symbolism in this book in all of John Steinbeck's writing, but it has simple prose that is just so much more behind it. So, like I said, anyone coming off the street can pick up Of Mice and Men and get the basic meaning of it. And then the more you read it and the more you think about it, the more symbolism comes out of it. There is so much hidden emotion behind this simple prose too. You read it and you think, oh, this is a sad story. But when you start to think about it more, the symbolism comes out and more emotions come out of it. And best part is that it's less than 100 pages long. It is a short classic, so if you have not picked it up yet, go and do yourself a favor and pick up Of Mice and Men, because you can't get much more for less than Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. One quote I have for you, and that is, "As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much more than a moment." And that is kind of like the perfect way to describe John Steinbeck's setting. I have one more quote. I lied. I have two quotes. "Try to understand men. If you understand each other, you will be kind to each other. Knowing a man well never leads to hate and nearly always leads to love." And that's the kind of hidden optimism that you find in John Steinbeck books. Next up, we have another classic, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Now, I've only read the first book in this series so far, but I definitely want to read the other books in this series. This is a classic supernatural paranormal horror released in 1976, which really surprised me. This is the story of Lewis, told in his own words, of his journey through mortal and immortal life. He recounts how he became a vampire and takes us through the historic streets of New Orleans. Lewis takes us to the Théâtre des Vampires in Paris, and it once started as a short story and now is kind of a staple in vampire lore. Why is this one on my list even though I've only read one book in the series? Our characters by far are some of the best characters I've read in literature, especially vampire literature. The emotions that we get in this book are so much more heightened than you normally get in vampire literature. A lot of times vampires are kind of described as cold creatures that don't have any feelings, but in Interview with a Vampire, our vampires have such strong emotions. I was pleasantly surprised by it. And really, when I was reading this book, I was just swept away in the story of it all. Following Louis and him becoming a vampire and his journey as a vampire, I was swept away in the whole story, and it was over before I knew it. Some quotes from this book: evil is always possible and goodness is eternally difficult. The only power that exists is inside ourselves. It was as if I looked into his eyes. I was standing alone on the edge of the world, on a windswept ocean beach. There was nothing but the soft roar of the waves. And that quote instantly took me to that scene. I could see that imagery happening, and you can't get much better than that. Next up, we have Augustus by John Williams. This is historical fiction released in 1972. It's a sweeping narrative that brings vividly to life a compelling cast of historical figures through their letters, dispatches, and memoirs. He is just 18 when his uncle Julius Caesar is murdered. Octavius, also known as Augustus, inherits the rule of the Roman Empire to become the first Roman Empire. This is the story of one man's dream to liberate a corrupt Rome from the fancy of the capriciously, and I love that word, crooked and the wildly wealthy. Why is this one on my list? Well, I read this one and immediately reread it. I first read it on audiobook, and then I immediately picked up a physical copy from my library and read it physically because there was so much amazing writing in there that I had to experience it through my eyes. And I don't hardly ever immediately reread a book like that. The audiobook was just incredible. The amount of emotion and passion that our narrator put into his narration had me completely moved. It brought these characters to life in a way that I've never felt in historical fiction before. I didn't really know much about these characters before I went in. I didn't really know much about ancient Rome before I came in, besides, honestly, what I read in the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar, and that is very, very limited because that's not really is based off of history, but historical teachers will tell you it's not all the history. It's only from one point of view, obviously. And this gives you a totally different point of view. And I love how it starts off with Julius Caesar's murder, because that is what Julius Caesar, the Shakespeare play, is all about, but from the point of view of the people that are doing the murdering. And I love seeing it from a different point of view. And like I said, it's just incredibly moving prose that just gave me goosebumps and tears the entire time. I have just one quote from this book. It's a long one, but it's so, so good. Mankind is the aggregate I have found to be brutish, ignorant, and unkind. Whether those qualities were covered by the coarse tunic of the peasant, of the white and purple toga of this a senator, and yet in the weakest of men, in moments when they are alone and themselves, I have found veins of strength like gold and decaying rock. In the cruelest of men, flashes of tenderness and compassion, and in the vainest of men, moments of simplicity and grace. And that just shows you the complexity of humankind. Next up, we have a contemporary book, The Violin Conspiracy by Brennan Slocum. This is a mystery thriller, musical mystery thriller, released in 2022. I have read both of Brennan Slocum's books, and this one is my favorite over the other one, Symphony of Secrets, but I highly recommend both of them. In The Violin Conspiracy, It is a mystery about a Black classical musician whose family heirloom violin is stolen on the eve of the most prestigious classical music competition in the world. Ray must race through time to get his precious heirloom back before his big performance. Why is this one on my list? A lot of reasons. It is such a unique idea of combining mystery and thriller and music all into one book. I love the way that he melded these together. I loved looking through time in the glasses of musical history that I wouldn't know hardly anything about. I love that idea of learning through this lens. There was such a fantastic plot with so many twists and turns. It kept me engaged and interested throughout the whole story. Musical references were so cool to experience, and I felt like I was writing a concert with crescendos, decrescendos, ritardianos, and accelerandos. Some quotes from this book. Alone we are a solitary violin, a lonely flute, a trumpet singing in the dark. Together we are a symphony. And I believe that one comes from actually the author's note, which is really, really touching, and I highly recommend you read that after you read The Violin Conspiracy. And what we can't teach is how to make a musician actually connect, emotionally connect with the pieces he's playing, to really care about the music and let the music tell its story. The next book up is the Embroidered Book by Kate Hartfield. This is a fantasy historical fiction released in 2022. Takes place in 1768, at least to start with. And so we have Charlotte, who is the daughter of the Habsburg Empress. She arrives in Naples to marry a man she has never met. And Antoine is set to France, where she is renamed Marie Antoinette at Versailles. Yes, the famous Marie Antoinette. In a time of vicious court politics, of discovery and dizzying change, the two sisters use the Book of Spells to take control of their own lives. Why is this one on my list? Page-wise, it's really long. It's like over 600 pages, but it never felt this long to me. The writing was just so flowing and interesting and engaging that it went by really fast. It was, like I said, it was always engaging. I never felt bored. I never felt like this is way too long. This needs to be shortened. The great character work kept me interested the entire time. I was interested in what was going to happen to these characters. Even though I know the story of Marie Antoinette and how that ends, I wanted to see it end on the page like that. And so I kept reading, if only just to get to that ending, but also because all of the characters on the pages were interesting to me. It read more like fantasy with history as a backdrop to me, partly because of the magic, partly just because of the way it was told. It felt more like a fantasy book than a historical fiction book. And I feel like this book may even be better on a reread, so I can't wait to reread this one again. One quote from this book: the world is on fire and they argue about the temperature of the flame. And I thought that is so fitting of the French Revolution time. Next up is The Voice of War by Zach Argyle. This is epic fantasy with an awesome audiobook, and it is a self-pub. A lot of the next couple books are self-pubs, and I can't wait to tell you all about these self-pubs. This was released in 2020 when Chris learns who is responsible for the missing Threadweavers. They come for him and his family. He must do everything in his power to protect those he loves, even if it means trusting strangers or worse, a growing voice in his own head. Why is this one on my list? First of all, Zach Argyle is one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. Second, this has very unique magic system, set of strong parents that are very unusual in fantasy. I feel like we're getting more and more of it lately, but it's still an unusual thing in fantasy. Exotic creatures. It felt like it was relatively short for high fiction, but not short enough where I felt like I was missing stuff. I still need to read the rest of this series, I know, but this is an amazing book one. And it has amazing world building in it that I was just blown away by. 2 quotes from The Voice of War. Self-betterment is the rarest form of ambition, and wishing, hoping, they are dangerous words. If you hope for something to be true and it is not, that realization can break you. But until then, while that belief runs warm in your blood, it can drive you to do amazing things. So let this book drive you to do amazing things. Dream big while you can still dream. We only have a couple more books left. Next up is Yellow Sky Revolt by Baptiste Pinson Wu. This is book 1 in the Three Kingdoms Chronicles series. It's historical fiction with some fantasy. This was released in 2022. Takes place in China in 184 CE. We start off with Liao Hu as an old retired warrior who is held prisoner. What this quickly becomes and organically turns into is Huo retelling the story of how he went from a young peasant boy to the symbol of the Yellow Turban Uprising's vengeful spirit to a famed warrior during one of China's most tumultuous times in an age of chaos. Why is this one on my list? This made me interested in China at the time, at this revolting time. I didn't know anything about Chinese history, and this made me want to read more about Chinese history. It gave us just the right amount of information. A lot of authors, when they're writing historical fiction, they tend to include too much information, and then it becomes more historical, less fiction, and it kind of bogs down the prose. But I felt like Pinson Wu gave us just the right amount of information where we understood the time and the setting and what was going on at that time, but it also provided its own history. This was an idea of history essentially from the losers, and we have this in a couple different books that I'm going to be mentioning specifically in this video. Usually history is told, as they say, from the victors, but in this book and some other books, history is told from the losing perspective, and that's so unique, and I love when authors do that. This story and magic unfolds slowly and gently and tells you there is lots more to come in this series, and I really need to continue this series also, and I can't wait to do it. One quote from this book: "No one might ever read my words, but I have to hope that someday, no matter how far in the future, someone will read the life story of Liao Hu, general of chariots and cavalry, and know that brave men fought for a just world." Next up, we have The Bleeding Stone by Joseph John Lee. This is book 1 in the Spellbinders and Gunslingers series. This is fantasy, historical fiction, and another book from the point of view of the, quote, losers. This book was also released in 2022. This is a fantasy retelling of the, quote, founding of America from the indigenous point of view. Our main character is Sen. She is outcasted by the Stone tribe due to the circumstances of her birth. She was born on the night of an eclipse, and in her tribe's belief, she is cursed because of this. She's saved by her father, the tribal chief. War wages, and Sen is continuously forced to make difficult decisions. And this is one that I've actually read the whole series, except for one novella that comes before it. But I absolutely loved it. Why did I love it? The characters felt like real people plucked from history. It was a well-written prose, easily imagined scenes I had no hard time imagining. I kept thinking about this book even after I finished it. I kept thinking about it. It gave me all the emotions I wanted. A quote from this one: "A people and culture do not cease to exist simply because your eyes have shut." I love that idea. Next up, we have The Trials of Ashmount by John Palladino. This is book 1 in the Tragedy of Sedan series. This is fantasy and grimdark. This was also released in 2022. According to Leslie at the Nerdy Narrative, this is the grimdarkest of grimdark books. Across a world rife with blood, betrayal, and brutality, 5 people wade through unexpected tragedies. An egotistical student, a fleeing refugee, a nomadic warrior, a fallen noble, and a criminal in hiding navigate the sinister dealings of politicians, two sudden wars and nefarious lies that surface at Ashmount, a university dedicated to teaching the 5 branches of magic. Why is this one on my list? Well, first of all, this made me interested in grimdark books. I hadn't read many before that, maybe one before that, and this made me interested in that series. And so in my eyes, this is the best grimdark because this is what made me interested in grimdark. Our characters make you feel things that you don't want to feel. The setting is just superb in this. You can see everything in this setting. One quote from this book, "The trace was just a fancy way of saying you could access your life force or soul by sacrificing part of your life. You could accomplish great things." And the last book up in this episode is The Two-Faced Queen by Nick Martell. This is book 2 in the Legacy of Mercenary Kings series. This is a high fantasy, dark fantasy. It was released in 2021, and there was not a whole lot that I can actually say in a spoiler-free summary for this book that doesn't give away book 1. What I can tell you is the Hollows is gripped in unrest and on the brink of civil war as an insurgency takes over. This takes up after book 1 ends, and honestly there's not much more I can say, but what else I can tell you is why this is on my list. First of all, if you want an engaging plot with complex characters, amazing world building, and a unique magic system, this is the series for you, the Mercenary Kings trilogy. I binged the last half of this book in about 24 hours, and I don't often do that, especially since I'm a multi-book reader. I usually jump from chapter to chapter. When I finish a chapter, I move on to another book. But this one, I binged the last half in 24 hours. It was so good. I couldn't stop reading it. It gave me all of the emotions. It's fantastic pacing. Not once did I think this too fast, too slow. It was like the perfect pacing for this book. And I thought, especially for a dark fantasy, it had incredibly accessible prose. Anyone can read this and understand it, what it means. Quotes from this book. "You didn't think it would really happen to you. Everyone thinks they're the exception. No one is. It's one of the great equalizers in the world." So that is episode 6 of my favorite 100 books I've read on Goodreads. We have just 3, maybe 4 more episodes left in this series of videos. Let me know in the comments below which one of these books have you read and loved. What books are you adding to your TBR? I can't wait to reread all of these books because I love them so much, and talking about them makes me so excited. As always, keep reading, and I love you all to the moon and back. Bye.